When did you and Allison come start attending Asbury?
95.
95?
95.
If I said it seems longer than that, would you? You wouldn't be offended. No, I was trying to think this morning. I was go, okay, I really don't know that much about you. I was trying to figure out, well, how do I introduce John? I said, well, he was raised by a band of gypsies, lost in the wilderness, raised by a family of bears. But John's going to share all that. Yeah. John, thank you for offering to share. And if you received the men's email this week, you saw I'm still putting out a request and an offer to have people share their story. Everybody's got one. Rick says that, I say that, and we're admonished to be ready to share our story. And that's a way that it's beneficial both for the person who shares and for us as listeners to be encouraged and challenged. So anyway, John, come on up.
All right.
And you got the con.
I got the floor.
You got the floor.
Well, guys, thank you for having me come and talk to you today. I'll tell you right off the bat, believe it or not, and Pepe said this last month, he's a little nervous. And you know what? I'm a little nervous whenever I get up and talk. I'm not a big person. I'm not a fan of public speaking necessarily, which is kind of strange because I was in the Air Force for 37 years. You'd think I'd probably have to get up and talk before people, and I did, but I didn't like it necessarily. But this is a subject that is close to my heart, so hopefully emotions won't come in and screw with me and mess things up. But what I want to talk to you about, I had a choice of two things that I could have gone with. I could have gone straight military and dazzled you with slides and everything else, or I could have gone my story. And believe it or not, that's first of all, that's what I went with. But it's interesting to listen as you're sitting at these tables to the stories of other people. And like Rick said the other day, everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a different path that got them to where they are today. And it was really weird this last week. Gary Ford was bugging me the last couple of weeks about, well, what are you going to say? I have no idea what I'm going to say. Well, finally this week I sat down and started to try to piece together what I was going to say. And it's really weird kind of reflecting over your life and trying to piece together your story. I didn't have this big crash bang salvation story that some people have. Mine is much different. And I don't have a circus in my background like J.P. Smith. I'm sorry, I don't have that exciting circus story to tell you about. But I have a story and I thought I'd share it with you. For anybody who served in the military, I want to thank you for your service. We in the military now, and I retired back in October, we get thanked a lot, which is an incredible thing. But there's a lot of people that used to serve, I'm thinking in the Vietnam era, they never got a pat on the back, they never got a welcome home. And that's a sad story. So I want to thank everybody that did serve because we need you. I don't know if this is going to take 10 minutes because I may rush through it, or it may take 3 hours, but I'll get through it. I'll get. Remember to breathe, it'll probably. Yeah, a half hour. So I'll kind of keep an eye on. I was born in Chicago, Illinois. My parents, my dad worked at Western Electric. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a subsidiary of the Bell, Southwestern Bell system, which probably isn't even around anymore either. They all kept dividing out there. But I was born in Chicago. I lived there for 10 months, and my parents moved to Oklahoma City. My dad got transferred early on in my life, so I have no recollection of Chicago or anything like that. I'm an Oklahoma guy. That wasn't necessarily the greatest thing when we had OU and OSU fighting amongst themselves, and you had Texas. I was Southwest Conference kind of a guy, and you know, we always had issues there. I was raised in a Presbyterian church, and I say that loosely. We attended a Presbyterian church in Oklahoma, and from what I can remember, and again, I was very young at the time, things were just normal. Went to church, went to VBS, went to all the things that everybody normally did. Actually sang in the choir. We had a youth choir, and I got to sing in that, and that's, I think, where my love for singing in the choir started. But something happened in the church. I can't get into the details of it, but something happened, and it drove my family out of the church. It was a very bad thing, but we left. And we became those people that sometimes you think about at Easter and Christmas. They only come Easter and Christmas. What's the deal? But that's what we did. And if you asked me if I was a Christian back then, I would say, yeah, I was a Christian because I believed in God. I kind of knew the stories, and I distinctly remember one of my fondest memories of church back in those days was the popsicle stick with the cutout, I don't know, somebody, you colored on it, and you had, that was VBS or Sunday school or something, but I remember that. So I've always believed in God. And I would say in the same breath in Jesus, but I had no relationship whatsoever. So, you know, it wasn't until probably in my 20s, latter half of the 20s, that I actually started to feel God pulling at me, and it was quite a pull. I'm going to backtrack just a hair. I always had, growing up, I always had a burning desire to fly. In the first grade, my teacher came to me, and or she was asking kids what their dads did, and my dad, he was a fighter pilot. Man, he was the best fighter pilot in the world. Never mind that he was a metallurgical engineer out at Western Electric, but he was a fighter pilot. And it was basically because I wanted to fly. I had this desire to fly. And growing up, I always had that pull. I was a huge, in junior high and high school, I was a huge fan of World War II and reading history, especially flying and especially the Pacific Theater. So when Irv told his story, man, oh, I was eating that up. That was Guadalcanal and all this other stuff. I was loving that. So anyway, I moved along through my school years in Oklahoma City, and I graduated in 1976. And I'll tell you, one side note on this is I wrote this a couple of days ago, and of course my wife read through it and corrected half of the stuff that I had said because I got it wrong. But she does keep me in line a little bit. So, but I had a real struggle trying to figure out where to go to school. The normal thing to do at my high school, you either went to OSU, Oklahoma State, or OU, and I had a brother and a sister that went to OSU, so there was no going to OU at that time. And but my oldest brother went to SMU in Dallas, Southern Methodist University. I had no clue where I wanted to go, but I think my mom took me down to SMU just to kind of view it. Loved the campus. It was a small campus back then, and just loved it. So I ended up going to SMU. Had no idea what I wanted to major in, but we just went with general studies initially. And it was at SMU that I met this guy down the hall. He's kind of a weird guy, but he long-haired. He loved rock and roll, but we became friends. And one day he came to me and said, "Hey, I need a favor." He said he had been dating this girl they were from New Jersey, and he'd been dating this girl forever, and they were going to eventually get married, which they did. But she was coming to visit. And she had I guess the parents weren't comfortable with her coming by herself. So Dave Moody, this is my friend, his little sister was going to tag along and be kind of like the chaperone and keep everything, going normal. So in Dallas, we went out to the airport and picked up Dave's girlfriend and his little sister, and that's where I met Allison. Which is a weird story when you think about your wife being your roommate's little sister that he wanted to get rid of and everything. But that was how and before I agreed to go to the airport, and my job was to keep Allison away from Dave so that he could have fun, and it was my job to keep her out of hair.
Wingman.
I was the wingman at that point. It was really weird because I had standards. Come on, guys. Everybody has standards. And I asked Dave, I said, so what does she look like? Oh, she's okay. I said, do you have a picture of her? No. So I was rolling the dice. But when I got to the airport, and Allison would have the same kind of reaction. She has her side of the story. But I saw this girl come off the plane, and oh, man, she was something else. But she said there was this guy leaning up against a post, and man, he was something else. Well, it turned out that we were something else together, and so we dated off and on for a couple of years. She moved down to Dallas. I think it was my senior year. She'll correct me on that. We decided in 1980 when I graduated, that was a big year for me because I graduated, we got married, and then I joined the Air Force. We had no idea what we were getting into. The recruiter kind of twisted my arm on a couple of things. I wanted to be a pilot. All my scores were good, and I met all the standards to get to be a pilot. There were no pilot slots in the schools at that time. So the guy convinced me, he says, oh, you just become a navigator. And if you become a navigator, when you get in, it's easy to transfer over. That was the first lie I heard. That was the first lie I heard, or fabrication or whatever. Because once you got into the system, there was no moving. In the old days, you didn't move. Nowadays, they do move people into pilot slots, but back then it was not going to happen. So we moved to California. That's where training went on. I was at, it took about a year to get trained out there, and I was a navigator on a KC-135. That's the tanker that's out here at McConnell Air Force Base. We got stationed, weird little story, we got stationed up at Plattsburgh, New York. Had no idea where Plattsburgh, New York was. Had to pull out an atlas, and lo and behold, I had a choice. Actually, I originally was supposed to go to Loring, Maine. I don't know if anybody knows, where. Yeah, well, Loring, Maine, I had either that or Plattsburgh, and I had no idea either one of them. I had no idea what they were. So I asked my instructor out in California at the school, I said, which should I choose? He's like, go to Plattsburgh, man, go to Plattsburgh. And it was a great base. It's, if you look at Montreal, I think it's Montreal, you go 60 miles south, it's on the U.S. border, or south of the border there, there's a little town. It's a little college town, Plattsburgh, and it's on the west side of Lake Champlain. Beautiful country, man. If you ever get a chance to drive up there, it is absolutely gorgeous country. So we settled into our Air Force life. The second story that they told me that I found out later was untrue was that you'll only deploy or go over, you'll be gone only about, maybe 60 days a year. Well, the very first year I was gone 180 days on different trips. And in the first year and a half, it was like 270 days. So I was gone a lot. And when you were home, back in the old days, we sat alert. The bombers and the tankers sat alpha alert, which meant we lived in a facility for a week at a time, and should the balloon go up, we'd run to our planes, launch, and go overseas to do what we needed to do and refuel the bombers on their way to attack whoever. In those days it was Russia. So that was a week at a time. So every 3 weeks I was on alert. I was TDY, which is temporary duty overseas or wherever. So I was gone a lot. So young in our career, we started to have kids. We had 2 boys up there in Plattsburgh. Things seemed to be going well. We joined a Presbyterian church, and we did it, I'm sure Allison could tell you a different story, but we did it, in my mind, because that's what you did. When you were young, married, and had kids, you went to church. That's just what you did. Now, Allison, there were reasons for her wanting to be in the church. Me, it was I was playing church in a sense. Allison became she was very far ahead of me as far as my faith and everything, and she really got involved in the church up there. It was a Presbyterian church, like I said, and started getting involved. And that was when the first of 3 events that happened in my life hit me. And the way I look at this is God, I'm kind of a work in progress. God did 3 significant things in my life that kind of smacked me upside the head. And the first one was the collection plate. The way I viewed money in the church was, this is my money, and I work hard for my money. So every week I'd throw in my normal $2 and the plate would move on. But then Allison kept indicating that she wanted to give more. And we had a huge battle over this because that's my money. And it's amazing that, as you will find at the end of the story, I'll tell you about it, but we slowly started giving more money, $5 a week. And it finally worked up to $20 a week, which when I was young in the Air Force, you didn't make a lot of money. I mean, I was an officer, but you still didn't make a lot of money. So that was a big struggle for me. And money was a big thing that God has worked on throughout my life. And the transformation is amazing. So we were in Plattsburgh for 4 years, and then we moved down to Abilene, Texas. Dyess Air Force Base down there. Again, I was gone a lot. We found a Presbyterian church, and one of the common threads that I found throughout my life is every church we went to, we had really good pastors. And so we met this pastor there that if I could say the man glowed, it probably would mean something to you, that this guy, he had the Spirit. He glowed, man. That's the only way I can describe it, is he just was amazing. His preaching was just amazing. He was an older man, and he actually had retired, and they were short pastors at that time, and they pulled him out of retirement just to kind of fill a gap. But man, that guy, Martin Thomas, he was an amazing man. Also started something else there. I started singing in the choir. This was a huge step for me because I didn't really want to get involved in the church, but I loved to sing, and I thought, well, I'll give it a try. Absolutely loved it. And that was another pull to me to get involved in the church. So we get to the next phase that God really kind of worked on, and this was a real challenge for us as a couple because I always thought it was good enough to be a good person. If you were a good person, you were going to get into heaven. And if you were a good person, that was good enough. I didn't need to do all this other stuff. I was a good person. You know, I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't do anything wrong. I was a pretty good kid. And of all my siblings, I was the best kid in the family. You know, my parents would, if they were alive today, they would testify that I was the best kid in our family. I don't know if that's what they would say, but this was a huge battle for me, struggling with the idea that I thought being good was good enough. But Allison said, no, it isn't. So we struggled with that. But there was one thing that I hung on to, is that Martin Thomas, this guy that glowed, I had a lot of respect for him, and I had a lot of, I really liked the man. So finally we got to a point where we needed to get this resolved. And I said, okay, fine. You ask Pastor if being good enough, or being good is enough. Because I was convinced at that time in my life that was all it took, just being good. And she said, she took on that challenge to ask him, and the answer came back, no, it's not good enough. So, hang on a second. That completely messed me up. So, did a lot of soul searching, and I came to the decision that through choir, through his preaching, through everything that was involved in my life, or getting involved in the church more, I made a decision, and it changed my life, and I dedicated my life to Christ at that point. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a cakewalk by any means. But another thing that was happening at that time in my life is rock music, Christian rock music really came of age. So we had our kids involved in church. I was getting involved in church. We had Christian music. Everything, Awanas was really big. And so we started to get involved much more. So this really changed the course of my life. I still was on the road quite a bit. And we had our third son when we were down in Texas. And then something happened where the war got in our way. I was called up and had to go overseas to do my duty over in the Persian Gulf. So we went through some rough times during that time frame, but you know, we grew a lot. And I hate to say this, but every time we were separated, we grew. Each one of us individually grew more, and not only individually upward, but together. We grew closer. This was in the day and age before internet and all this other stuff. I was stationed over at Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey. We flew missions to Iraq and bombed from the north, while most of the public stuff that you saw was stuff that happened in the south of Iraq. But we put in a lot of missions there. And back in those days, if you wanted to talk to somebody, you either wrote them a letter and mailed it, and it eventually got there, or we were given a coin that we could use in the telephone. There was only like 1 or 2 phones that had access to get back to the States. And you waited in line, and you waited forever, and you'd drop in your coin, and you'd get an operator, and you'd finally get through to your family. So we didn't talk much. We didn't get a lot of opportunities to discuss much, but that's how I stayed in touch back in those days. Then we were at a point where I needed to make kind of a decision in my life as far as direction career-wise. There was an opportunity to go to Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, which is just east of St. Louis, and I took it. It was a command level assignment where I was a staff member. We got there, we loved it there. They have 4 seasons actually there, which is kind of a weird thing because you don't get that down here that much. We miss spring here. I got promoted to major at that point, and much to my chagrin, they kept moving me up the, as we called it, the food chain or promotions of stuff. And I was put in charge of tanker operations for Southwest Asia, Africa, and Europe. So it was my responsibility in my shop that worked for me to find all the tankers throughout the country and send them on these temporary duties overseas. So I did that for 3 years. And then things really came to a head at that point. Our kids were getting older. The future for us, I was active duty, the future for us was we're going to move every 3 years. And it was hard on the kids, so we had to figure out what we were going to do. I didn't want to get out of the Air Force because I liked what I was doing, but we just didn't want to do this every 3 years move. And this is where being in the right place at the right time really came in handy. Because I was headquarters, I was in a place where I knew people who knew people. And they knew that this new unit was standing up at McConnell Air Force Base in, of all places, Wichita, Kansas. And they were just standing up the unit. It was a reserve unit. So it was different than what I was used to, and I had to figure out if this is what I wanted to do. Now, you have to understand that for 14 and a half years, I'd been in active duty, and I was moving along just nicely. As far as retirement, you only had to make to year 20, and you were guaranteed that retirement. And here I am at 14 and a half years. So I had to decide whether I wanted stability. In the reserves meant I could stay here and stay here and stay here. I didn't have to move anymore. Or I had the promise of being moved all over the place, doing jobs that I didn't necessarily want to do and keep my family on the road. So we chose to go to the reserves. It was a big leap of faith at the time because I had no idea what I was getting into. The commander, I came down here and met him, and he couldn't promise me a full-time job. He said, I can hire you as a part-timer, but we'll keep you busy. Well, I have to pay for my kids, you feed my kids and get a house and stuff. And he goes, don't worry about it, I'll take care of you. We'll get you a full-time job, but you got to trust me. A man that I hadn't just met today, I had to trust. And I struggled with that quite a bit. It was a huge leap of faith. But this is another little thing I point to that really helped me out is there was a singer back in those days, Michael W. Smith. And he was singing a very popular song at the time, Go West, Young Man. So I took that, my little mind, like he must be talking to me because I needed to go west because Illinois is east of here, so we made the big decision. We came out here. Never regret it. I had a full-time job in 4 months. I was put in charge of the mission planning shop. Actually, I had a choice of whatever I wanted. The commander said, what do you want? What job do you want? And I wanted to do mission planning. It was what my background was mainly. And I ran the shop that plans all of the missions that our reserve forces fly. We do all their planning for them so that when they come in, they take the mission package that we give them and they go fly wherever they go in the world. I absolutely loved doing that kind of a job. So we did our typical, we moved here, we did the typical church shopping, as I called it back then, and we looked around. We shopped through a bunch of churches in the area, and some of them, man, were cold as ice. You know, you might as well not have been there. But we went to this one, and it had this guy up there, and he was just very evangelical kind of a preacher, and he just was on fire. And Dennis Wallace, of all people. And we really liked listening to him. But the other thing we found is that Asbury had the friendliest people, man. It was just unbelievable. So we settled here. Again, we had, this is the third of three things. This one might tie me up a little bit, but we had one other struggle in our life is Allison just kept getting busier and busier in the church. I was much more of a Christian at that point, but I still struggled with things. And Dennis Wallace came to our house and asked her to be the, I don't even know what it was called back then, ministry coordinator or whatever it was, but he wanted her to work at the church. My wife never worked throughout my career, and now he's wanting to take my wife and and bring her into the church. And again, Allison was getting more and more involved in the church. And I did my choir stuff, but I was I did it to a point, but I didn't want to get totally involved in it. But I did get involved in the choir here, and that really helped me quite a bit. The one thing that one thing that got me was my wife started raising her hand in praise. That had never happened, ever, in any church we'd ever attended to. But this one, people raised their hands. I can't raise this hand because it's had shoulder surgery, but did this. And I was in the choir, I'm looking at my wife's raising her hand and praising God, and I'm like, okay, I got an issue with this. I was extremely jealous of God and her affection for Him. Whew, that messed with me a lot. But during that time, something happened that got me through it. There was this silly thing called Walk to Emmaus. It was my wife wanted to do it. It was a couples thing where the wife would go and then the man would go, and it was a weekend trip or locally. But she really wanted to do it, and it's one of these things. Well, your wife wants to do it. You know, if you want to keep the marriage going and everybody happy, you do what Mama wants. So she did it. But there was a big question of whether John was going to do it. I had a convenient excuse not to because I was supposed to deploy again. But magically, I probably shouldn't use that word, magically, I had surgery the fall of 2002. I had neck surgery, and they fused C5, 6, and 7 together. And at this time, when it was my time to deploy, the last minute they decided, no, you're not physically ready to go yet, so they pulled me off the tour. So I lost all my excuses to go to the Walk to Emmaus. And so begrudgingly, and I mean there must have been claw marks in the ground as I'm being pulled there, I went to Walk to Emmaus. And I got to admit, guys, the first night there was rough. My wife left me. I know Bob Kiesling was there. His family was there to see us off, and it was tough. But they did a lot of silly things, and I was at that time in my life. I looked at that stuff. That's just really silly. It's almost like VBS type of stuff. That's silly. I'm an older man. I shouldn't have to do all this silly stuff. But I gave it the old college try, and by the next day, the speaker started talking, and God changed my heart. I mean, just absolutely changed my heart. My most favorite part of it was going to chapel services. Ah, unbelievable. That church downtown, that I think it's First. Their chapel, the Holy Spirit there, man, it is just like unbelievable. But it changed my life. I broke down at the final farewell and everything. You sing all these little songs and stuff and everything else, and I was just crying because it had changed my life. And from that point on, I would actually say at that point on, I became a Christian. A strong, believing Christian. I'm not perfect by a long shot. I still consider myself a work in progress. We just are a family that has pulled together and come together with Christ as our center, and that to me was one of the biggest turning points in my life. But I point back to one thing I said earlier about money. For me, money was incredibly important. Making the dollar mattered. And I think part of that is because in the days of being active duty, you got a paycheck. Here's your paycheck. But in the reserves, you had to work for your money in the military sense. I was what is considered an Air Reserve technician, which meant I was a full-time civil service employee, which I got a paycheck. And I also had a military side to my job where I had to work on the weekends. You hear about the weekend warriors and stuff. So I was always chasing the dollar with the reserves. But it was interesting to think back to the early 80s when I was grabbing $2 in my hand and very reluctantly letting it go into the plate. Over time, God has worked through my life, and now, guys, I'm not bragging in any way, shape, or form. We tithe. We tithe and we give above. Not because I want you to know that, because, hey, look at me, I'm tithing. But that's the difference God made in my life. I went from $2 begrudgingly to this. It's been an amazing walk for me, and reflecting back on this, it's an amazing story to me to have gotten to this point. But we are strong believers. I love this church and live for Christ. And now I'm starting a new phase in my life. I've retired 6 months ago. And people still ask me, how's retirement? I can't wipe the smile off my face, guys. I cannot wipe the smile off my face. Some people struggle with retirement. Some people, I've heard of people that have high-stress jobs that they retire and they pass because they just can't handle the transition. I'm here to testify, Lord, I don't have that problem. I'm enjoying retirement thoroughly. It's a new phase of life for us, but I look forward to spending a lot of years with Allison and Asbury Church. And that's what I have to tell you. That's my story. Thanks. That's my story.
Thank you, man.
Get all my junk.
That's okay. That's okay. You know, Ernestine and I, we went on a walk early 90s while Tom Smith was here. And I've said that, you talked about Allison raising her hand. There was a point in my life that after my walk, I felt like there was a chain that had been cut and that my arm could finally come up.
Yeah.
It changed my life.
Yeah.
And I know that several of us have been on a walk to Emmaus. Highly recommend it. And take an opportunity to take a weekend if you can. You won't, I don't believe you'll regret it. It can change your life. So let me just close this out here. Father, we just thank you for this time today. Thank you for John and how you've worked in his life, how you've moved him, touched him and Allison and the family, how you have physically moved them, how you spiritually moved them, how you've protected them and continue to nurture them. Father, we just thank you for their presence here at the church. Thank you for John sharing his story today and revealing the different aspects of how you have changed him in so many ways. And so, Father, we just ask that you'd be with us this week as we go about our different duties and things in life. We just ask that you just be with us this weekend through the services. And we just ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Amen. Thank you, gentlemen.